Imagine walking into a high-stakes negotiation thinking you own the entire building, only to find out the guy sitting quietly across the table just bought the deed. That is exactly what just happened to Washington. Something seismic just occurred in global trade, and the political establishment in the United States completely missed it. The mainstream media is treating this like just another political trade spat, another headline about tariffs to toss onto the daily pile of noise. They are completely missing the structural earthquake that just fractured the North American economy. Donald Trump spent months threatening to crush Canada with tariffs. He expected capitulation. Convinced that the pressure would force Ottawa to fold, the assumption inside Trump's circle was aggressively simple. Canada depends on the United States entirely too much to fight back. But what happened instead has stunned economic insiders from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. Mark Carney didn't respond with loud speeches. He didn't respond with retaliatory tariffs. He didn't fire off angry late-night social media posts. He responded with strategy. Quietly, methodically, and almost completely under the radar, Carney built a global trade network designed to do one specific thing: reduce Canada's dependence on the United States. And when that network finally went live, the reaction in Washington wasn't anger. It was immediate, unadulterated panic. It was confusion. It was the sudden, chilling realization that the leverage Donald Trump thought he held over his northern neighbor might not actually exist anymore. To understand the sheer scale of this miscalculation, you have to understand the arrogance of the American assumption. For 70 years, Washington has held one unshakable foundational belief about North America: Canada needs the United States far more than the United States needs Canada. Nearly 3/4 of all Canadian exports have traditionally flowed south into American markets. That level of dependency created a powerful, blinding arrogance in Washington. So, when Trump dusted off his favorite playbook, threatened massive tariffs, apply maximum public pressure, and force the other side to beg for a deal on American terms, his inner circle thought it was a guaranteed win. The speeches and social media posts followed the exact same message again and again. Canada, Trump said, was taking advantage of the United States. Canada depended on American markets to survive. Canada would have absolutely no choice but to crawl back to the negotiating table once the threat of sweeping tariffs became real. His political advisors bought into their own myth. They looked at the trade deficit, they looked at the map, and they concluded that Canada's economy was simply too heavily integrated with the United States to risk a confrontation. They believed they were dealing with a cornered animal. But Mark Carney saw the chessboard very differently. You have to understand who Mark Carney is to understand why Washington failed so spectacularly to predict his next move. Carney is not your typical politician. He is not a reactionary. Before stepping into the political arena, he spent decades operating inside the highest, most exclusive levels of global finance. He served as the governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, steering the country through a global meltdown that shattered other economies. Later, he became the governor of the Bank of England, tasked with navigating the chaotic financial fallout of Brexit. Few leaders on the planet have a deeper, more intimate understanding of international markets, complex supply chains, and true economic leverage. He knows how money moves. He knows how markets react. And most importantly, he knows the difference between political bluster and structural power. So when Trump's tariff threats started dominating the news cycle, Carney did not react emotionally. He didn't rush to the microphones. He didn't start a public chest-thumping confrontation. Instead, he did something far more dangerous from Washington's perspective. He began building options. He began building a trap. For the next several months, while American political debates dominated the headlines, while cable news panels argued over the legality of Trump's proposed tariffs, Carney's government quietly started expanding trade relationships across the globe. Negotiations with the European Union suddenly intensified. Talks with Japan drastically accelerated. South Korea, Mexico, and several rapidly growing Southeast Asian economies suddenly found Canada very, very interested in deeper economic cooperation. None of these negotiations seemed dramatic at first glance. Trade discussions happen constantly around the world, and most of them lead to nothing but photo ops and empty press releases. That's precisely why Trump's advisors didn't treat the news as a serious threat. They assumed Canada was simply posturing. They assumed Ottawa was trying to artificially strengthen its position to save face before eventually caving to Washington's demands. But something highly unusual, something surgical, was happening behind the scenes. Instead of focusing on a single, flashy, large-scale agreement that would trigger alarms in Washington, Carney's strategy spread across multiple critical industries simultaneously. This is where the genius of his plan reveals itself. He didn't just look for a new buyer, he re-engineered the entire machine. Energy exports, long the lifeblood of U.S.-Canada trade, were quietly redirected toward overseas buyers hungry for stable fuel supplies. Canadian lumber producers, who have historically provided the absolute backbone of the American housing market, were heavily encouraged and subsidized to expand their sales into booming Asian construction markets. Pharmaceutical companies began exploring and finalizing preferential agreements with massive European health systems. Agricultural exporters opened intense negotiations with new, wealthy partners across the Pacific. Piece by piece, sector by sector, Canada was building something entirely new. They were building an economic safety net designed to operate at full capacity, even if trade with the United States completely collapsed. And that is the exact part Washington underestimated. The Trump administration believed tariffs would create unbearable pressure on Canada. But Carney was preparing for a world where that pressure simply wouldn't matter anymore. By diversifying Canada's trade flows, he was slowly, methodically severing the leverage the United States had ruthlessly relied on for decades. At first, the numbers looked small to the untrained eye. A few percentage points shifted here, a few independent contracts signed there, nothing that seemed capable of changing the gravitational pull of the entire North American economy. But then, the true scale of the strategy started becoming clear. Canadian trade officials quietly revealed internal projections showing that these newly finalized global agreements could reduce Canada's reliance on American markets by nearly 40% within just a few years. Let that number sink in. 40%. That number absolutely stunned economists who had long believed North American supply chains were too deeply entrenched, too physically integrated to ever change quickly. If those projections proved accurate, it would mean something historic. For generations, the United States had been the unavoidable, inescapable center of Canada's economic universe. But Carney's strategy suggested that this foundational truth was dead. And while Washington was still publicly debating whether the tariffs should begin next week or next month, the physical infrastructure for this new Canadian trade system was already being built. Ports on the eastern and western seaboards of Canada were aggressively expanding their shipping routes toward Europe and Asia. Major energy conglomerates were quietly finalizing long-term, unbreakable overseas contracts. Manufacturing suppliers were retooling their production lines to serve new international customers with different regulatory standards. All of this happened quietly. There were no dramatic announcements. There was no political celebration. There was just ruthless, cold preparation. By the time Trump's tariff threats reached their absolute peak, Canada had already moved its most valuable pieces across the global economic chessboard. And the most terrifying part for the American political establishment was that very few people in Washington realized how far the strategy had already progressed. Because while the political conversation in the United States was entirely focused on the daily drama of tariffs, Mark Carney was focused on something much bigger. He was building a trade system designed to survive and thrive without American permission. And when that system finally became visible, the reaction inside Trump's inner circle changed instantly. What once looked like a simple, easily winnable tariff dispute suddenly began to look like something far more serious. It looked like a catastrophic strategic miscalculation. And the first person to publicly acknowledge that harsh reality would soon be one of the most respected, untouchable voices in global business, Warren Buffett. What Buffett said next would send absolute shockwaves through corporate boardrooms, financial markets, and political offices across North America. When Warren Buffett speaks, people in Washington usually listen. But when Warren Buffett speaks about a major historic economic mistake, the entire business world stops breathing. That's exactly what happened when he finally addressed the growing tension between the United States and Canada. Buffett rarely comments directly on political disputes, especially international ones. His reputation has always been built on long-term thinking, on careful, rational analysis, not on political drama or partisan theater. That's exactly why his words carried so much devastating weight when he described the situation as an expensive lesson for the United States. According to Buffett, the real issue was never simply tariffs. Tariffs come and go all the time in global trade disputes. They are a temporary tax. The real danger, he explained, was the catastrophic damage being done to a relationship that had taken more than 70 years of careful diplomacy and investment to build. The United States and Canada share one of the most highly integrated economic systems in the history of the modern world. Supply chains cross the border thousands of times every single day. A car part manufactured in Ontario moves into an American factory in Michigan, gets modified, ships back to Canada, and then returns to the U.S. to be placed in a final vehicle. Energy flows south through massive vital pipelines. Agricultural goods move north and south depending on the season. This system was never designed to be easily separated. It was designed to function like a single, unified economic engine. That is why Buffett warned that sudden politically motivated disruptions could have consequences far beyond what arrogant policymakers expected. But what really shocked American business leaders to their core was the second part of Buffett's message. He made it perfectly clear that Canada was no longer sitting still, waiting like a subordinate for Washington to make the next move. Instead, Canada had already begun shifting its long-term economic strategy toward new partners across the world. And here is the brutal reality of global trade. Once those shifts begin, they are nearly impossible to reverse. Think about it this way. When a massive corporation signs a 5-year or 10-year contract with a new supplier or a new buyer, that relationship becomes the new normal. Factories physically adjust their assembly lines to meet the new demand. Global shipping routes are permanently redrawn. Thousands of workers are moved to new projects. Billions of dollars in investment flow into new infrastructure, new rail lines, and new port terminals. Once those physical and financial changes happen, businesses do not just politely go backward because a politician in Washington changes his mind. That is exactly what Mark Carney understood, and what Donald Trump completely failed to grasp. By the time Trump's tariff threats reached their loudest, most chaotic point, Canadian companies were already finalizing ironclad agreements with partners outside North America. Canadian energy producers were expanding massive export commitments to European markets that were desperately searching for stable fuel supplies outside of Russia and the Middle East. Canadian mining companies holding the critical minerals needed for the future of technology were building long-term partnerships with Asian manufacturers hungry for raw materials. Technology firms were strengthening deep ties with European innovation networks. These agreements were not symbolic political gestures. They were legally binding contracts with billions of real dollars attached to them. And that is when the first unmistakable signs of panic began appearing inside parts of the American business community. Executives in American industries that rely heavily on Canadian resources started asking very difficult, very uncomfortable questions in their boardrooms. What happens if Canadian lumber becomes significantly harder to access? What happens if our energy supplies become 20% more expensive overnight? What happens if auto parts manufacturers begin prioritizing overseas buyers because their contracts are more stable than ours? The answers were not comforting. They were terrifying. Take the construction industry as just one example. Canadian lumber has been a critical foundational resource for American home building for decades. American builders depend on those supplies because they are geographically close, highly reliable, and historically affordable. But if Canadian producers begin shipping more of that lumber to international buyers who are willing to pay higher prices for guaranteed long-term contracts, American builders suddenly face a serious existential problem. Material costs go up immediately, construction projects slow down, and housing prices, which are already crushing the American middle class, rise even further. You, the consumer, end up paying the price for Washington's hubris. Now, multiply that specific problem across multiple massive industries at the exact same time. The American auto manufacturing sector relies heavily on cross-border supply chains. As I mentioned, a single vehicle assembled in the United States can contain parts that cross the Canadian border half a dozen times during production. Disrupting that finely tuned, just-in-time system doesn't just create a minor inconvenience. It can physically shut down entire assembly lines within 48 hours. When assembly lines shut down, workers get sent home. When workers get sent home, they don't get paid. The economic dominoes start falling fast. Energy markets present another terrifying challenge for the United States. Northern states heavily rely on Canadian oil, natural gas, and electricity just to keep the lights on and the homes heated during brutal winters. Replacing those sources quickly is physically impossible. The infrastructure, the pipelines, the grid connections, and the distribution systems were built entirely around decades of mutual cooperation. You cannot just build a new pipeline overnight because the president tweeted about tariffs. This is why Buffett's warning struck such a powerful, resonant chord. He wasn't describing a short-term political disagreement that could be solved with a handshake. He was describing a permanent structural shift in economic relationships. And structural shifts tend to create extreme winners and extreme losers. In this case, the early signs suggested Canada might be positioning itself surprisingly well to be the winner. By diversifying its export markets so aggressively, the country was gaining something it had rarely possessed before in trade negotiations with the United States: leverage, unadulterated leverage. For decades, Washington assumed Canada had absolutely no alternatives. That assumption gave American negotiators enormous, unfair influence. But if Canada could successfully redirect a large portion of its trade toward Europe, Asia, and other global partners, that American influence would shrink dramatically. And that is exactly the scenario that is beginning to unfold right in front of us. American investors started noticing something highly unusual in the financial markets. Companies heavily exposed to Canadian imports began facing deep uncertainty. Their stock prices started to wobble. Meanwhile, Canadian firms positioned within these newly forged global trade routes started attracting massive waves of fresh investment. Money was quietly, efficiently moving northward and overseas. Financial markets are extremely sensitive to risk, and the perception of risk surrounding U.S.-Canada trade was growing exponentially. Investors absolutely despise unpredictability, especially when it involves two of the world's most interconnected economies. Meanwhile, through all of this chaos, Mark Carney remained almost completely calm in his public appearances. He wasn't celebrating in the media. He wasn't attacking Washington or insulting American leadership. Instead, he repeated a simple, devastatingly effective message again and again. Canada, he said, was open to fair trade with everyone, including the United States. But it would absolutely not allow its economy to depend on a single partner that could change the rules without warning. It was a subtle but incredibly powerful signal to the rest of the world. Canada wasn't trying to aggressively isolate the United States. It was simply proving, with cold, hard numbers, that it didn't have to depend on America anymore. And as that chilling reality began sinking in across financial markets, the political conversation in Washington started shifting as well. Suddenly, the question was no longer whether Canada would fold under pressure. The new question was much more uncomfortable, much more terrifying for American policymakers. What if Canada had already found a way around that pressure entirely? And if that was true, then the strategy coming from the Trump administration might not just fail. It might actually permanently strengthen Canada's global position at the direct expense of the United States. That possibility began to worry people far beyond the political arena. Business leaders, institutional investors, and global economists were all starting to see the exact same pattern emerging. Mark Carney hadn't simply responded to Trump's threats. He had weaponized them. He had turned them into a historic opportunity. And the full devastating consequences of that move were only beginning to appear. The moment the rest of the world started realizing the true scale of Carney's strategy came when Canada officially announced the finalized results of its months of quiet negotiations. These trade agreements weren't incremental adjustments. They weren't minor tweaks to existing deals. They were seismic shifts in the global economic order. Canadian energy, pharmaceuticals, lumber, and agricultural exports were suddenly being aggressively rerouted to Europe, Asia, and other international markets with preferential terms that far outpaced anything the United States was currently offering. The goal was glaringly clear to anyone paying attention. Canada was no longer going to rely on Washington's approval to thrive economically. And for Donald Trump, who had built his entire negotiation strategy, his entire political brand on intimidation and dominance, this was a waking nightmare. Trump's team, which had been so unbelievably confident that Canada would blink under the intense pressure of tariffs and threats, was suddenly scrambling in the dark to understand what had just happened. Advisors who had spent months proudly predicting Canadian capitulation on cable news were forced to acknowledge a very harsh, very public reality. The leverage the United States thought it had simply didn't exist anymore. The contracts were already signed. The supply chains were already redirected. The markets were physically shifting while Washington was still aggressively debating its next move. Panic began to ripple quietly through political circles in D.C., although public appearances and desperate social media posts tried to maintain the crumbling illusion of control. The truth was obvious. Let's break down exactly how Carney executed this masterstroke. He didn't simply react to Trump's threats, he anticipated them months in advance. While Trump was tweeting insults and threatening a crippling 25% tariff on all Canadian goods, Carney was meticulously negotiating complex deals with multiple major global economies simultaneously. Each agreement was carefully crafted to strengthen Canada's global market access, severely reduce reliance on the U.S., and create alternative, redundant supply chains that could function completely independently of American ports and American buyers. Lumber exports were now being fast-tracked to Asian construction markets willing to pay significantly higher prices. Energy exports were legally tied up in long-term overseas contracts, creating absolute stability and guaranteed revenue streams that Washington could not politically disrupt. Pharmaceutical exports were gaining unprecedented preferential access to highly regulated European healthcare markets, ensuring Canadian companies could maintain massive growth even if U.S. domestic demand entirely faltered. The brilliance of Carney's approach lies not just in the sheer diversification of markets, but in the impeccable timing. By the time Trump's administration fully realized the immense scale of these global agreements, the infrastructure was already solidly in place to sustain Canada's newly found economic independence. The U.S. could threaten tariffs all it wanted, but the brutal consequences for Washington itself had suddenly become unavoidable. American industries that depended heavily on Canadian imports, construction, automotive, energy, pharmaceuticals, were suddenly facing intensely higher costs, massive supply shortages, and crippling operational disruptions. Lumber prices in the States were surging. Auto manufacturers nervously reported critical part shortages. Energy bills were visibly climbing in northern states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Pharmacies in multiple states faced severe constraints on essential life-saving generic medications. The ripple effects were immediate, they were tangible, and they were politically dangerous for an administration that promised economic dominance. Meanwhile, Warren Buffett's comments added a massive, crushing layer of pressure. By publicly labeling the situation an expensive lesson for the United States, Buffett validated the deep concerns that had only been circulating quietly in corporate boardrooms and exclusive financial circles. When someone of Buffett's legendary stature signals to the world that the American approach to Canada is fundamentally flawed, markets respond immediately. Stocks of American companies heavily dependent on Canadian goods began to systematically falter. Institutional investors shifted their massive portfolios toward Canadian firms and global partners who were now perfectly positioned to benefit from Carney's new trade architecture. Highly skilled workers even started considering relocating to Canada's demonstrably more stable market environment, further strengthening Canada's economic position while clearly signaling that Trump's unpredictable policies were driving deep uncertainty at home. This wasn't just about economics anymore. This was a direct, humiliating blow to American credibility on the world stage. For decades, Washington aggressively relied on the perception that Canada and other North American partners had absolutely no viable alternative to American markets. Mark Carney shattered that arrogant assumption in a single, highly calculated move. He definitively demonstrated that a mid-sized economy could entirely manufacture its own resilience, leverage, and independence, even under the direct threat of aggressive tariffs from a superpower. And Donald Trump, for all his trademark bluster, had very few options left on the table. The U.S. could choose to escalate the tariffs, but his own advisors knew that would only mathematically harm domestic consumers and American businesses even more. They could attempt to crawl back and negotiate, but any discussion would now start from a humiliating position of deeply diminished leverage. Or they could do nothing, passively allowing Canada to solidify its global trade relationships further, which would aggressively increase the strategic cost to the U.S. in the critical months and years ahead. By the time the full crushing implications hit Washington, it became glaringly clear that Carney had not only neutralized Trump's threat, he had actively turned it into a permanent structural disadvantage for the United States. American businesses were forced to painfully reconsider their entire supply chains. Investors had to completely rethink their exposure to risk. And policymakers had to confront the incredibly uncomfortable truth that their foundational assumptions about Canadian dependency were no longer valid. The strategic consequences were rippling far beyond simple trade numbers. This was fundamentally about credibility, global influence, and long-term positioning on the international stage. The stakes only escalated when industry-specific crises began loudly surfacing across America. Construction companies in the U.S. officially reported a projected 17% increase in baseline material costs over the next fiscal quarter, directly due to Canadian lumber shortages. Automotive plants faced unprecedented costly part delays as Canadian suppliers unapologetically prioritized their new long-term contracts with European Union and Asian manufacturers. Energy costs in the northern states surged violently as pipeline agreements diverted necessary resources to new international partners, and local pharmacies scrambled desperately to source generic medications that had become totally unavailable because Canadian producers were simply fulfilling more lucrative, legally binding contracts abroad. Trump's response was predictably chaotic, entirely underscoring the massive contrast between the two leadership approaches. Frantic tweets and disjointed public statements tried desperately to downplay the severity of the situation. Threats of even more additional tariffs were angrily floated, but even his most loyal trade advisors privately acknowledged that such measures would financially gut American consumers far more than they would ever hurt Canadian exporters. Attempts by the State Department to suddenly negotiate directly with Carney were politely, almost clinically brushed off by Canadian officials, sending a massive signal to the globe that Ottawa was absolutely no longer negotiating from a position of vulnerability. Every single move Trump made seemed heavily reactive, lacking any coordination, and increasingly, embarrassingly futile. At the exact same time, Carney remained methodical, completely calm, and relentlessly strategic. He wasn't gloating on television. He wasn't intentionally escalating the conflict for cheap domestic political gain. He was simply executing a master plan that had been quietly in place for months. He was actively demonstrating to the entire world that competence, deep foresight, and meticulous preparation could entirely outmaneuver political bluster, empty threats, and blind overconfidence. And as the global financial community watched closely, the stark contrast between the two approaches became the defining story of the era. Carney, the master strategist who saw the whole board, versus Trump, the frantic improviser reacting entirely to events that were already irreversibly set in motion. The reality is now undeniable. The United States is not just facing temporarily higher costs and disrupted supply chains, it is confronting a fundamental, permanent recalibration of power dynamics in North American trade. Mark Carney quietly rewrote the rules of the game, and Washington is only just beginning to grasp the terrifying scale of what has been done to them. The expensive lesson that Warren Buffett warned about wasn't some distant theoretical risk for a textbook. It is unfolding in real time right now in your grocery bills, your heating costs, and your local economy. By now, the full heavy impact of Carney's strategy is hitting every single corner of American economic life. What had looked like a simple, easily winnable trade spat just months ago has mutated into a multi-layered, highly complex crisis with deeply real consequences for everyday businesses, struggling consumers, and even state governments who are watching their budgets bleed out. Trump's initial arrogant assumption that Canada would instantly fold under the threat of tariffs has been completely overturned. Carney's approach has done significantly more than just neutralize American leverage. It has physically shifted the leverage directly into Canada's favor. And the longer this painful scenario plays out, the clearer it becomes that the consequences aren't just financial. They are deeply political, deeply strategic, and psychologically devastating to the American establishment.